I think I didn't do anything wrong, just told the truth too late. I slept with another man before our wedding, and now my husband says the baby's not his. Everyone acts like I planned this, but I swear I was just scared. And now, he's the one calmly gathering proof, while I'm the one falling apart. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I'm Lyra Mornell, and I swear I didn't do anything wrong. At least, not in the way everyone says I did. I slept with another man a week before our wedding, but it was supposed to be my last act of freedom, not betrayal. I told myself it didn't count because the vows hadn't been spoken yet, the rings weren't on, and love isn't supposed to feel like a contract anyway. Evan and I were solid, serious, safe, maybe too safe. I just needed one night to remember I was still wanted. Then life moved on, the wedding happened, and I convinced myself secrets could dissolve with time. But secrets don't dissolve, they wait. When the baby came, Evan started looking at me differently. He didn't yell, didn't accuse, just watched me like he already knew. And now, after all this quiet tension, I'm the one being treated like a criminal while he moves in silence, collecting proof, preparing something I can't name. Everyone says he's the victim, but they didn't live my choices. They don't understand what it's like to be trapped between guilt and pride, between truth and survival. I thought honesty would save me. I didn't know it would end everything. I woke up that morning thinking honesty would fix everything. The kitchen light was too bright, the smell of toast sharp in the air. Evan sat at the table, reading something on his phone. His mug was half full, steam rising in slow curls. He looked calm, the kind of calm that made me nervous because it meant he was already thinking about something deeper than he'd ever say out loud. I told myself this was the day to tell him. We were going to be parents soon. It was time to clean the slate. That's what good wives do. Make things clear before they grow messy. That's what I told myself as I set my mug beside his and said, I need to tell you something. He looked up, eyes steady, polite even. He said, okay. I hated how simple that sounded. Just okay. No curiosity, no panic. I wanted him to be scared, to fight for me before he even knew why. I said, it was before the wedding. A stupid night. It didn't mean anything. He blinked once, then twice. Who? Someone from work. It was just a mistake. It's not like I was married yet. He didn't react. He just set his phone down gently, like he was afraid to break the silence instead of me. I kept talking because the quiet was unbearable. It was before we said our vows, Evan, before everything. I thought I should be honest now. I didn't want to start our family with a lie. He nodded, very slowly. You think this is honesty? That stung. I said I was trying to make things right. He said, then why does it sound like you're justifying it? I wanted to cry, but crying would have made me look guilty, so I folded my hands and said I only wanted to clear my conscience. He said nothing else, just finished his coffee and rinsed the mug clean. When he left for work, I saw his phone light up on the counter. A calendar reminder flashed. Downtown 11:30 a.m. I assumed it was a meeting. Still, the time stayed in my mind like a tiny itch. By noon, I was at my mother's house. She always knew how to help me turn guilt into something softer. When I told her, she put her hand over mine and said, Sweetheart, men overreact to things they don't understand. You didn't cheat. You were just finishing one chapter before starting another. That made me feel better for about 5 minutes. I told her Evan barely reacted, that he didn't even raise his voice. She said that was worse, that quiet men keep score in their heads. When I came home later, he was there, working at his desk in the corner of the living room. The printer hummed faintly beside him. He didn't look up when I walked in. I said, Are we going to talk about this? He said, You already did the talking. I told him I wanted to make things right. He said, You can't fix something you don't think is broken. I hated how calm he sounded. No shouting, no accusations, just this polite coldness, like he'd stepped out of our marriage and was watching it through glass. That night, he moved his laptop into the guest room. I asked if he needed space. He said the light was better there. When I asked what he was working on, he said, Sorting things. I asked, Sorting what things? He said, Everything that matters. I tried to laugh it off, but when I walked past the door later, I heard the faint click of a drawer locking. The next morning, his side of the bed was cold. On the counter were 2 mugs again. His spotless, mine still half full. It annoyed me how he always washed his first, like proving something. I told myself he was sulking. That's what men do when they don't know how to forgive. At work, everyone said I looked pale. My coworker Clara asked if everything was okay. I said we were fine, that marriage is just hard sometimes. She said, Evan's the quiet type, right? Those are the ones who plan their exits before you notice. I laughed, pretending it didn't bother me. But the phrase stuck. Plan their exits. By evening, I was scrolling through old photos on my phone. There we were at the wedding, his hand over mine, eyes soft. We looked perfect. I told myself that meant we could survive anything. When he came home, he placed a grocery bag on the counter and said, You forgot to buy detergent? I said, Sorry, I was tired. He said, You looked awake last night. The way he said it made my skin prickle. I said, Can we not do this? He said, We already did this. I asked if he hated me. He said, Hate would mean I still expect something from you. That one landed like a slap. I told him he was being cruel. He said, You call truth cruelty when it's not in your favor. I stormed off to the bedroom, slammed the door, and cried into the pillow. I kept thinking he'd follow me, that he'd finally shout, demand, accuse, something that meant he still cared. But the hallway stayed quiet. The only sound was the low hum of the shredder from the guest room. Later, I found myself talking to my sister Nadia over the phone. She said I was brave for confessing, but maybe the timing was wrong. I said there's no right time for honesty. She said, Then you should have chosen silence. I told her she didn't understand marriage. She said, Maybe not yours. When I hung up, I checked Evan's desk. The drawers were all locked except one. Inside was a folder labeled Household. Receipts, printouts, all organized. He'd never been this tidy. On top sat a sticky note. Bring forms. Forms for what? That night, I went to bed early, pretending to sleep when he came in. I heard the faint tap of his phone, the soft rustle of papers. Then his voice, quiet but firm, saying into the dark, I'll handle it properly. The next morning, I asked what that meant. He just looked at me for a long moment and said, It means I'm not going to yell. I'm going to finish what you started. He left soon after, jacket over his arm, calm as ever. I stood in the kitchen staring at the empty counter where his mug should have been. I wanted to throw something, to make noise, to make him feel something. Instead, I sat down and told myself I was still the good one. I'd been honest. That's what mattered. But as the day went on, small things kept catching my eye. His laptop was gone, so were 2 binders from the office shelf. The printer tray was empty, just the faint smell of toner in the air. By evening, I saw him outside in the driveway checking the car trunk. When I asked if he was going somewhere, he said, Not yet. I said, Then why are you packing? He said, Preparation isn't the same as leaving. I wanted to argue, but something about his tone stopped me. I told myself he'd cool down, that all couples go through phases. I even called my mother again, told her Evan was being distant. She said, He'll come around once he realizes how much he loves that baby. That comforted me until I hung up and realized she'd said that baby, not his baby. That night, I walked past the guest room again. The door was cracked open and the faint glow of his computer filled the hall. On the screen, I caught a glimpse of a spreadsheet. Columns labeled dates, notes, statements. He noticed me watching and closed the laptop slowly. You shouldn't be up, he said. I asked if he was tracking me. He said, No, just recording what's true. I said, That sounds like a threat. He said, No, Lyra, it's called record keeping. I wanted to tell him I loved him, that I hadn't meant to hurt him, that everything could still go back to normal. But when I opened my mouth, the words came out wrong. I said, You're making this worse by acting like a detective. He said, You already made it worse. I'm just taking notes. I stood there, shaking, while he went back to typing. The printer whirred again, printing another blank page. He pulled it out, checked the tray, and stacked it neatly on the table. Then he looked up and said, Good night. That was all. Just good night. I went to bed alone again, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd done the right thing, or if I'd just given him the final reason to leave. I told myself honesty mattered more than comfort, but even that didn't sound true anymore. In the dark, the hallway light flickered. The faint hum of the shredder came again, steady, rhythmic. I turned my face to the wall and tried not to listen. The next morning, I decided to take control of the story before Evan could. If people were going to whisper, I'd make sure they whispered my version. That's how survival works. If you frame yourself first, no one else gets to define you. I started at work. Everyone had already noticed the way I'd been checking my phone every few minutes, the dark circles under my eyes. Clara, always the gossip, leaned over and asked, Everything okay at home? I smiled like it was nothing. Just normal married life. He's being dramatic. She smirked. What did you do? Nothing, I said, except tell the truth. By lunchtime, 3 people already knew that I'd confessed something personal and that Evan was having trouble forgiving me. The story spread the way I wanted it to. I was the brave wife who told the truth. He was the cold, controlling husband who couldn't handle honesty. I even laughed about it with my team, saying how men think transparency means betrayal. They nodded along. When I got home, Evan's car wasn't in the driveway. I figured he was working late again. The house felt too quiet, that kind of silence that hums against the walls. I wandered into the guest room, the one he'd claimed as his office now. It was spotless. On the desk, I noticed his old USB sitting under a folder labeled Archive B. My stomach twisted. He never labeled things like that before. I told myself it was just work. Still, I plugged it into my laptop when he wasn't home. The files were all empty except one, a simple document named Timeline. It only had a single line typed inside. Wedding week. Discrepancy noted. I slammed the laptop shut and laughed out loud. He was ridiculous, making lists like some detective. I told myself he'd get tired of the act eventually, that silence was just his way of sulking. But that word, discrepancy, wouldn't leave my head. The next day, my sister Nadia called. "Mom told me you confessed something," she said. "You okay?" I told her I was fine, that I was just being honest before the baby came. She hesitated, then said, "You sure that was for him, or for you?" I snapped that she didn't know what she was talking about. She said softly, "Maybe not, but you sound like you're trying to convince yourself." That made me angry enough to hang up. I didn't need judgment from someone who couldn't keep a relationship past 6 months. By evening, Evan still wasn't home. I checked his location on my phone. He'd shared it months ago. It showed him downtown near the same time that Calendar Alert had appeared yesterday. Downtown, 11:30 a.m. The pin hovered over some office tower near the courthouse. I told myself it was just work, but something about the precision, the same hour, 2 days in a row, made my skin crawl. When he finally walked in, he smelled faintly of paper and printer toner. He greeted me politely, asked if I'd eaten, then went straight to the sink and washed his mug. I said, "Are you going to keep acting like this?" He said, "Like what?" "Like a robot. You're being impossible." He said, "I'm being consistent. There's a difference." I wanted to scream, but I forced a laugh instead. "You're recording things, aren't you? I saw your little list." He looked at me calmly. "It helps me remember what's true." I told him he was paranoid. He said, "Truth doesn't need to hide." I called him controlling. He said, "That's your favorite word when you don't get to decide the story." He left the room before I could answer. That night, I called my mother again. She told me to stand my ground, that men like Evan weaponize silence because they can't handle confrontation. "You need to remind him who you are," she said. "He's lucky you're still here after everything." That made me feel powerful again, like maybe I wasn't the one unraveling. So the next morning, I posted a short story on my social page, something vague but emotional. Sometimes honesty hurts, but at least it's real. I added a picture of my wedding ring on the countertop, captioned, "Still fighting for what matters." Within an hour, the comments started rolling in. Friends from work, old classmates, even my cousin, all telling me how brave I was for speaking up. One wrote, "Men don't deserve women who own their truth." I liked that one. When Evan came home that night, I was waiting at the kitchen table, scrolling through my comments. "People actually support me," I said. He looked at me with that quiet expression I was starting to hate. "People support whatever sounds good in public," I said. "You make it sound fake." He said, "Because it is." I told him the post wasn't about him. He said, "Then why did your mother call me asking what happened?" I froze. "She called you?" "She did," he said. "She told me to stop making you feel guilty for being honest." I tried to laugh it off, but he kept talking. "You've told the story so many times you probably believe it now." I said, "You're twisting things." He said, "I'm quoting." That word made me pause. Quoting. It sounded too deliberate. Later, when I walked past his desk, the printer clicked on by itself. A single blank sheet slid out. I rolled my eyes, pulled it free, and tossed it into the trash. When I bent down, I saw something else. Under the corner of the desk, taped neatly, a small silver USB labeled only by date. The hair on my arm stood up. When he came into the room, I tried to act normal. "You're getting really organized lately," I said. He said, "It helps." "For what?" I asked. Yeah, he looked at me, expression unreadable. "For clarity." That night, I barely slept. Every small sound felt like evidence. His footsteps, the faint clack of his keyboard, the low whir of the shredder again. By morning, I'd convinced myself to fix the story again. I texted my friends that Evan had been distant since the pregnancy, that I was doing my best to hold us together. They responded with hearts and words like "stay strong." At lunch, Clara brought me a cappuccino and said, "You're trending locally. People love your post." I smiled and said, "It's not about attention, it's about truth." But that night, scrolling through the comments again, I noticed one that froze me. An account with no profile picture wrote, "Truth has timestamps too." I deleted it immediately, but my hands were shaking. When Evan got home, he said nothing about the post, but he went straight to the study again. I followed him, leaning against the doorway. "You're not going to talk to me at all?" I asked. He said, "I already did." I said, "You're going to make people think I'm crazy." He said, "You're doing that on your own." I snapped that he was humiliating me with his silence. He said, "No, Lyra. You did that when you turned confession into content." He closed the door. I stood there until I heard the faint click of a lock. The next morning, I walked into the living room and found him sitting at the table with his laptop open. He was scanning papers, sliding them into a folder. I tried to peek at the screen, but he minimized it too fast. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Sorting," he said again. "Sorting what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he opened the drawer, placed the folder inside, and closed it with a quiet click. I noticed the new label written neatly on the tab, Archive B. I said, "You already used that label." He said, "Some stories need more than one archive." I asked what that meant, but he didn't reply. He picked up his mug, rinsed it, and left for work without another word. That afternoon, I met Nadia for coffee. She looked uneasy. "You're posting too much," she said. "You're turning this into a spectacle." I told her I was setting the record straight. She asked, "Against who?" "Against assumptions," I said. She leaned back. "Evan's not even saying anything. You're fighting ghosts." I told her she was taking his side. She sighed, said, "No, Lyra. I just don't think you realize how quiet people fight." When I got home, I saw Evan's phone charging on the counter. A new text preview blinked on the screen. Just an emoji, a briefcase. I froze. That night, he came home later than usual. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and his eyes looked clearer than I'd seen in weeks. He said, "You've been busy online." I said, "At least I'm not hiding." He said, "No, you're broadcasting." I told him people supported me. He said, "They will, until they see the rest." "What rest?" I asked. He didn't answer. He just smiled faintly, that calm, distant smile that made me want to throw something. Before going to bed, I checked the guest room again. The bed was perfectly made, smooth enough to look staged, no wrinkles, no signs of sleep, just order. I realized for the first time that he wasn't waiting for me to apologize. He was waiting for something else, something final. The dinner at his father's house was supposed to be a reset. Thomas had called earlier in the week, saying he and Ruth wanted to have us over for a calm evening. I agreed before even asking Evan. Maybe I thought getting out of the house would force him to talk. Maybe I just wanted an audience again, someone to see that I was the reasonable one. When we arrived, everything smelled like roasted chicken and thyme. Ruth greeted me with her usual polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. She hugged Evan a little too long. Thomas patted his shoulder and said, "Good to see you, son." Then he looked at me and added, "We've missed you both." Dinner started quietly. I tried to fill the silence by talking about work, the baby, anything. Evan mostly ate in silence, asking only for the salt once. I kept glancing at him, trying to catch his eye, but he stayed focused on his plate. Finally, I said, "We've been having some communication issues. Just stress. You know how it is." Thomas looked up, calm but sharp. "Stress doesn't cause silence," he said. "It causes noise. Silence comes from decision." I forced a laugh. "You always talk like a fortune cookie." He smiled faintly. "Sometimes fortune cookies tell the truth." Ruth changed the subject, asking about the nursery. I talked about colors and curtains, grateful for something normal. But halfway through my sentence, Evan's phone buzzed. He glanced at it once, turned it face down, and slid it into his pocket. I caught a glimpse of the notification before he moved, just a single emoji. A briefcase. Something inside me twisted. I told myself it was just work. Still, the way he looked after reading it, composed, almost relieved, made my stomach knot. Thomas must have noticed because he said, "Everything all right, Evan?" Evan nodded. "Yes, Dad, just following up." Following up? The same phrase from his late-night phone calls. I said, "He's been obsessed with lists lately." Thomas looked at me. Lists? I laughed lightly. Yeah, organizing everything like we're under audit. Receipts, bills, files, even conversations. He writes them down. Thomas's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked toward Evan. Good habit to have. That shut me up for a second. I realized then that Thomas wasn't surprised. He approved. After dinner, Ruth offered coffee. I followed her into the kitchen to help. She said softly, "You look tired, Lyra." "I'm fine," I said. She hesitated, then asked, "Is Evan sleeping?" I almost snapped, "How should I know?" but caught myself. "He's fine, just busy." She stirred the sugar slowly. "He's been by the house a few times this week, picking up papers from the garage." My hand froze on the countertop. "Papers?" She nodded, pouring coffee into cups. "Old records. Thomas keeps everything. Evan asked if he could borrow a few things." "What kind of things?" "Bank statements, insurance forms, household bills." My throat went dry. "Why would he need those?" She handed me the coffee and said, "Sometimes people collect what they need before they start changing their lives." I nearly dropped the cup. When I returned to the table, Evan and Thomas were talking quietly. I caught only the end of it, Thomas saying, "Make sure it's dated properly." I tried to smile to pretend I hadn't heard, but the words buzzed in my head like static. On the drive home, I told him his parents were acting weird. He said, "They're being honest." I said, "Honest about what?" He said, "About what happens next." I told him he was being dramatic. He said, "You've said that about every truth that scared you." The rest of the drive was silent. When we got home, he went straight to the guest room again. I followed him. "You're not just sorting things anymore, are you?" I asked. He said, "No, I'm building context." "Context for what?" He looked at me, eyes calm and cold. "For reality." I told him he was making me look like the bad guy. He said, "You did that when you turned me into content." That made me furious. I said, "You want to punish me because I told the truth before the vows? You want to play perfect now?" He said, "No, Lyra. I want to be finished pretending." Then he shut the door. I sat in the living room for a long time, staring at the empty hallway. My phone buzzed. It was my mother. "How did dinner go?" she asked. I said, "They're turning him against me." She said, "Thomas never liked you being the strong one." That was comforting for a moment. Then I thought of Thomas's quiet tone when he said, "Make sure it's dated properly." The next morning, I found Evan already dressed, standing by the counter writing something in a small notebook. I asked if he wanted breakfast. He said, "No, I have an appointment." I said, "Downtown again?" He didn't answer. When he left, I opened the notebook he'd left behind. Most of the pages were blank, but one had a short entry. June 10th. Conversation, admission repeated. Witnesses aware. I slammed it shut. My hands were shaking. I called Nadia, desperate to hear someone tell me I was overreacting. She said, "Lyra, if he's writing things down, he's not planning a fight. He's planning an ending." I said, "You're all paranoid." She sighed. "Maybe, but he's calmer than anyone I've ever seen in that position. That's not anger. That's precision." That word stayed with me all day. Precision. By evening, I couldn't take the silence anymore. When he came home, I forced a smile and said we should have friends over. "It'll look normal again," I said. "People will stop asking questions." He said, "You're still worried about how it looks?" I said, "What else do I have left?" He didn't answer. I went ahead and invited a few couples from work. They showed up with wine and laughter, and for a brief moment, I felt in control again. I told a story about our rough patch and how we were working through it. They all nodded, sympathetic. Then someone, Clara, of course, said, "I saw your post the other day. You're so brave for sharing." Evan looked at me across the table, expression unreadable. I smiled and said, "Honesty matters, right?" He said, "Yes, it does." The tone in his voice made the room go quiet. Clara laughed nervously. "Well, cheers to truth." Everyone raised their glasses, except him. Later, when the guests were gone, I accused him of making me look foolish. He said, "You did that yourself." I said, "You're enjoying this." He said, "No, I'm documenting it." That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked into the guest room again, needing proof that I wasn't crazy. The desk looked cleaner than ever. On the shelf was a small folder labeled Utilities. I pulled it forward. A tiny piece of tape on the back caught the light. Peeling it away, I found a small USB drive hidden underneath. Silver, dated last week. I stared at it, heart pounding. I wanted to take it, open it, find out what he'd been saving, but I couldn't move. The next morning, he noticed me watching him make coffee. He said, "You don't have to keep pretending you're not afraid." I said, "Afraid of what?" He said, "Truth has its own timing." That scared me more than shouting ever could. Later that day, I went to my mother's. She said Evan had called Thomas again, something about needing a few signatures. "What signatures?" I asked. She hesitated. "He didn't say, but Thomas looked relieved." When I got home, Evan's car was in the driveway. Inside, the house was silent again. On the kitchen counter sat 2 mugs, his, spotless, mine, half-finished. On the table was a folded napkin with something written in his handwriting. Dinner was a test. Thank you for confirming. I stood there, shaking, trying to make sense of it. What test? From down the hall, the sound of the guest room door clicking shut echoed through the quiet. I looked around the kitchen. Everything was too neat, too deliberate. Even the baby's ultrasound photo was pinned perfectly straight to the fridge. I wanted to crumple it, to ruin the symmetry somehow, but I couldn't move. I told myself again that he was bluffing. He wouldn't actually do anything. He was too calm for that. Still, when I went to bed that night, I locked the door for the first time. The clinic smelled like lemon cleaner and anxiety. I sat in the waiting room pretending to scroll my phone while the nurse typed something behind the desk. Evan had insisted on driving me but hadn't come inside. He said he had calls to make and would wait in the car. When my name was called, I followed the nurse into the small exam room, all white walls and hums from machines. She smiled politely and said, "We just need to confirm your estimated conception date again." I nodded. Easy, routine. But when she read the numbers on the chart, her tone changed. "You said your last cycle was in March?" "Yes." "Then this due date doesn't quite match." I laughed nervously. "Maybe the app I used was off?" She smiled kindly. "It happens, but it's a few weeks difference. Your husband might want to review this with the doctor later." My stomach dropped. I told her Evan was busy, that I'd tell him myself. She nodded, scribbled something, and left. I sat there staring at the chart. The math didn't lie, but I still told myself it could be wrong. Machines make mistakes, right? The night with Adrian had been before the wedding, before everything, before it could possibly matter. I told myself that 3 times until it sounded true again. When I came out, Evan was leaning against the car, scrolling through his phone. I said, "Everything's fine." He said, "Good." He didn't ask for details. He didn't look at the folder in my hands. Just opened the car door for me and drove in silence. Halfway home, I couldn't take it. "You're not even curious," he said. "About what?" "About the baby. About anything." He said, "Curiosity comes before knowing. I already know." I laughed. "You think you're so wise." He said, "No, just patient." I wanted to scream, but I bit my lip until it hurt. At home, I called Nadia. I told her the doctor said the dates were off. She was quiet for a long time, then said, "Do you want me to tell you what you want to hear, or what's true?" "Tell me I'm fine," I whispered. She sighed. "Then you're fine." I hung up before she could say more. That night, Evan worked late again in the guest room. I could see the blue glow of his screen under the door. When I peeked in, he was on a website about notary services near me. He minimized it quickly. "Planning something fun?" I asked. He said, "Just future logistics." "For what future?" He said, "The honest one." I walked away before I cried. The next day, I took Lena to the playground. It was sunny, normal, ordinary. Kids laughing, swings squeaking. She ran ahead and shouted, "Daddy's coming later?" I hesitated. "Maybe, sweetheart, he's busy." She looked disappointed. "He's always busy." I said, "He's working for us." But she just went back to the slide, and I sat there realizing how strange it sounded, even to me. When we got home, there was a new stack of envelopes on the table. One had my name on it. Inside was nothing. Just a blank page. At first I thought it was a mistake, but then I noticed the faint smell of toner. Another silent message. I texted him, "What is this supposed to mean?" He didn't reply. That evening I cooked dinner anyway, hoping the smell of food would make him sit down, talk, act like a husband again. But when I called out that it was ready, he just said through the hallway, "I already ate," I said. "We can't keep living like this." He said, "You started living like this before the wedding." That broke something in me. "You're cruel," I said. He said, "No, Lyra, I'm organized." Later, I found the drawer of the hallway table slightly open. Inside were labeled folders: bank, utilities, statements, household. Each one neat, dated, complete. I flipped through them until I saw a small sticky note stuck to the back of one. File uploaded successfully. I froze. When I looked up, he was standing in the doorway. "You shouldn't be going through my things," he said calmly. I said, "You shouldn't be treating me like a suspect." He said, "Then stop acting like one." I dropped the folder and walked out. That night, I went to my mother's again. I told her about the clinic, the folders, the silence. She shook her head and said, "He's making you paranoid on purpose. You have to remind him he's not the only one with power." I asked, "What am I supposed to do?" She said, "Make the world see your side before he shows his." I didn't answer. When I got home, he was asleep, or pretending to be. The clock read past midnight. I stood in the doorway watching him breathe. For a moment, he looked like the man I married, the one who used to pull me close, whisper plans for the future, promise we'd always fix things before sleeping angry. Now, all that was left was quiet. I thought about the doctor's words, the dates, the math I kept denying. I wanted to believe that love could still overwrite numbers, that memories could rewrite facts. But deep down, I knew Evan was already building a case while I was still writing excuses. That evening, the house felt smaller than ever. The living room, once warm and inviting, now carried the faint smell of printer toner, the subtle scent of order and intent. Evan sat in the guest room, the door closed but not locked. I could hear the low hum of his laptop, the soft tapping of keys, the occasional shuffle of papers. I wanted to march in, demand answers, but a part of me knew he wasn't going to argue. He was doing something final, deliberate. I tried to reclaim control in the only way I knew how. I picked up my phone and drafted another post, explaining my side of the story to the friends who had been supportive. I called it honesty before parenthood, careful to frame it as bravery rather than betrayal. I added a soft, reflective caption about transparency, accountability, and love. I hit send and watched the notifications pile up. Hearts, claps, comments calling me courageous. When Evan finally appeared in the kitchen, I smiled, ready for him to acknowledge my effort, to react the way he always had before. "Everyone supports me," I said, waving my phone. "You should be proud, not distant." He didn't look at the screen. He poured his coffee slowly, set the cup across from mine. His eyes met mine, calm, steady, almost unreadable. "I've been handling things properly," he said. I laughed, light but sharp. "Properly? What does that mean? You're not even upset?" He tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Being upset is for impulsive people. Proper handling requires precision." The words made my chest tighten. I had laughed before, believing his silence was weakness. Now I saw it for what it was, methodical, quiet, controlled. I opened my mouth to argue, to assert that honesty mattered, that transparency was bravery. He shook his head slightly, and I froze mid-sentence. "I've already made plans," he said, calm as the hum of the refrigerator in the background. "Plans that ensure everything moves forward correctly." "What plans?" I asked, though my voice was smaller than I wanted. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to the counter, picked up my half-finished mug, rinsed it clean, and placed it in the opposite corner from his own. Then he looked at me and said, "You've made this about perception, not truth. I'm correcting that." I swallowed hard, a cold lump forming in my throat. I wanted to tell him he was overreacting, that our life was more than timelines and files, that love could overcome secrets. But something in his gaze told me I wouldn't win. Later that night, I sat on the edge of the bed, pretending to work on a blog post. The glow from my laptop illuminated my face, but it didn't hide the growing panic inside. I heard the faint whir of the shredder in the hallway, the click of drawers, the soft tap of a USB being placed into a slot I couldn't see. Every sound was deliberate. Every movement was controlled. I realized, with a jolt, that Evan had been preparing this entire time. Every folder, every note, every quiet action had been a step towards something I couldn't yet name. He hadn't lost his temper, hadn't shouted, hadn't stormed out. He had waited, watched, collected evidence, ordered reality. The next morning, I found a small stack of envelopes on the kitchen table. One had my name written neatly in his handwriting. I picked it up with shaking hands, expecting nothing, hoping it was just another blank page to frighten me. But inside, I found a single folded document. I couldn't read the top line in time before he walked past, glancing at me without expression. "You need to understand," he said. "This isn't about punishment. It's about clarity." I tried to laugh, to make light of it. "Clarity? You've barely said a word." He looked at me, eyes steady. That's the point. Words without action are meaningless. I am acting properly, legally, and with precision. You'll see soon enough. The words hit me like a cold slap. I wanted to cry, scream, beg him to explain, but I didn't. I just nodded, the fear coiling tight in my stomach. Throughout the day, I tried to reclaim control. I messaged friends, reassured them that Evan was just being distant, that everything was fine, but I couldn't ignore the subtle signs. The neat folders lined up on his desk, the spreadsheet open on his laptop, the calendar alerts labeled with times and places, the USB drives tucked under papers with sticky notes like bring forms. Even Lena seemed to notice the tension. She asked me quietly, "Mom, is Daddy mad at you?" I told her no, that everything was fine, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. She nodded but didn't smile back. Instead, she went to her toys, leaving me alone with the growing awareness that nothing about tonight would be fine. That evening, Evan finally came out of the guest room. He carried nothing, spoke little, but every movement was deliberate. He placed another envelope on the hallway table. I bent over to look at it, heart pounding. "I'm done with pretense," he said. "It's time to handle this properly." I tried to sound light. "Handle what? I've already told the truth." He set his jaw, calm, precise. Truth is not enough without action. Everything else will follow now. I wanted to argue, to insist that honesty mattered, that confession had been brave. But the stack of papers, the folders, the hidden USB drives, the calendar reminders, they all told me I had already lost control. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the house, every hum from the guest room, every click of the door latch seemed loaded with intent. I sat in the dark, staring at the floor, wondering what he had planned, what the envelopes contained, what reality I would wake up to. By morning, I was exhausted but desperate to maintain the narrative I'd built online. I drafted another post, something subtle, something that framed me as brave and misunderstood. I called it Owning Your Choices. I added a picture of my hands on the nursery crib, captioned with a heart. I hit send, my stomach twisting, hoping it would distract me from the gnawing sense that Evan had already set the pieces in motion. When he came home, he didn't look at my phone. He didn't ask about the post. He simply walked to the guest room, closed the door, and the faint hum of his laptop resumed. I realized then that he wasn't bluffing. He wasn't punishing me with silence. He wasn't planning to yell or storm out. He had a method, a plan, and it was already in motion. I tried to remind myself that he wasn't cruel, just methodical. I tried to tell myself it was still possible to reclaim control. But when I walked past the guest room and saw the small USB labeled by date tucked under the household folder, I knew. This was bigger than any argument, any confession, any post. I felt the walls of the house close in. I had imagined a confrontation, words exchanged, tears, apologies, maybe even forgiveness. But what Evan had been preparing was quiet, precise, lawful, and final. That night, I confronted him softly. "You're really doing this, aren't you?" He looked up from his laptop briefly, calm as a lake. "Yes, properly." I swallowed hard. "Properly? What does that mean?" He placed the laptop gently on the desk, picked up my mug, rinsed it clean, and set it back down. Then he said, "I mean legally, with clarity, with certainty. Everything else follows." I realized then that my days of framing the story, controlling perception, and justifying choices were over. He had regained control in the quietest, most deliberate way possible. I had thought honesty was power. I had been wrong. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I heard the printer hum again. A new page slid out, crisp and blank, waiting. I shivered. I had spent weeks manipulating the narrative, turning every confession into applause, every admission into a performance. But Evan's calm showed me that precision and law were stronger than spectacle. And I knew tomorrow, whatever he did next, would leave me powerless. The courthouse lobby buzzed with murmurs and footsteps. I clutched my purse, expecting confrontation, expecting pleading. Instead, a process server stepped forward, handed me an envelope, and said my full name aloud. Inside was a court notice, paternity verification, and temporary custody terms. The crowd paused, cameras clicked, my mother's hand froze midair. Evan stood silently beside me, calm as always, watching the papers land in my hands.